everyone. Thank you for joining us for another eMarketer Tech Talk, where we host guests from all areas of ad tech, martech, and media. I'm Nancy Teferasantes, Senior Vice President, eMarketer Insider Intelligence. Today, we'll hear how marketers can redefine identity. This is your opportunity to learn, and we want it to be an educational journey. So please use the chat window during our conversation to send in questions, and I'll get to as many as I can during the Q&A, so please keep them coming. Now I want to introduce my special guests. I have with me today Casey Rogers, Senior Director of Identity Solutions Consulting at TransUnion, and his guests, Emily Proctor, Executive Director, Data and Technology Consulting at OMD USA, and Joe Stanhope, Vice President and Principal Analyst from Forrester. Casey, Emily, and Joe, welcome.
Thanks, Nancy. I'm super excited to be here today, share some of my thoughts, and have a great conversation with Joe and Emily. So yeah, let's get into it. So in the context of developing and executing on a successful consumer data strategy, the marketing world as we know it has changed, is changing, will change dramatically and radically. And a number of the key market forces that we believe are driving that change are things like consumer behavior, which is perhaps the most impactful change we as an industry are experiencing. And as humans, when, where, how we shop, how and where we consume content. Consumers are expecting better and better and more personalized and frictionless experiences in the ecosystem in the marketplace, independent of channel or touch point. Next, and perhaps the most nuanced, are the combined forces of consumer privacy and data deprecation. If new and seemingly ever-changing data privacy regulations, this constant debate around digital identity and the life after the cookie, again, all sort of tied back and centralized to a better informed set of consumer expectations. Then we have an attempt by marketers to simply, simplify the fragmentation in the ad and martech ecosystem. So, reducing down the number of partners they work with to a select or strategic few, the continued growth and reliance on the walled gardens, the proliferation of retail media networks. Again, all this in an attempt to deliver a better, more meaningful experience to the consumer. And lastly, the velocity with which we're experiencing marketers move not only the data itself, but their data operations into the cloud, and really truly transforming what's possible within the marketing ecosystem. Again, against the backdrop of different and new consumer expectations, privacy considerations, and siloed data. So how are marketers meant to turn these challenges into a meaningful growth strategy? Well, it's imperative to have a sustainable addressability strategy. The ability to reach consumers when, where, how they are, to simplify your operations. What data do you have on hand? Where's it stored? How's it organized? Who can access it? It's imperative to break down the data silos that exist between those internal data sets and those data sets and partners you want to work with in the ecosystem. And then it's imperative to establish interoperability between yourself and those partners. Along with rapidly changing consumer-centric market forces, there's this notion of data chaos. It's impacting marketing across multiple dimensions. So, the challenges with data quality, incomplete or duplicate records that we see, and it's been observed somewhere around 90% of marketers have consumer records that are incomplete. So what do you do there? Organizations are spending valuable data science resources, as an example, just simply organizing that data and not necessarily doing analytics or driving insight generation and taking action on that, but developing a true strategy. The current privacy landscape with, I think it's over 150 countries have regulation or draft legislation around consumer privacy. This constant off again, I'll call it the off again, on again relationship around digital or device identifiers. And where today IDFA opt-in is only around 18%. And then this continued rise of discrete marketing channels, examples being the rise of CTV streaming, the proliferation of retail media networks. And we asked, and over 80% of marketers responded saying they were concerned about cross-channel capabilities in the future. So if you want to be successful with your consumer data strategy, you've considered the current market forces, you've aligned against those or other key imperatives, and you're embracing this notion of data chaos. What does it mean to achieve interoperability and actually take some action? So you need to be able to ground your data compilation, your data hygiene, your data analytics, collaboration, whatever that is, on trusted identity. And you need the flexibility to effortlessly move from one data source, say website visits, call center activity, via some ecosystem identifier, phone number, IP address, the physical address inside of a trade area, the cookie, and you need to be able to move it via that identifier to a landing space for analytics, modeling, your internal landing space, so that you can then reach out to a destination for, exposure, targeting, messaging. And you need to do that all in a way that's consumer focused and privacy sensitive. And so sort of with that, I want to again welcome Emily and Joe. Hi, Emily, Joe. This isn't just me talking today, but thankfully. And I'm excited to dig into some more specific topics with you guys. So let's start with Joe. Joe, I talked about the market factors driving some of these changes in consumer identity. What are the most important changes from your perspective in how consumers interact with marketers and marketers perceive that identity?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and thanks for having me today. Looking forward to a great conversation as well. Picking up on some of the items you discussed, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment. You have a kind of a pile up right now of concurrent trends, and this isn't new. It didn't just arrive, last month or last week. I mean, marketers are no stranger to disruption. This kind of change has been happening for years, honestly, even prior to COVID and the pandemic. You have this set of, look, consumers are more demanding and sophisticated. The set of touch points, right, and devices we operate in keeps expanding. And you mentioned data deprecation, right, which is really this roll up of regulatory change, walled garden behavior, technology changes, and so on. And I think the net effect is that it creates a set of opposing forces that's very difficult for marketers to reconcile today, and why you have to be thinking about these things and planning in advance very specifically. And I think why the topic of the webinar is really important today, because on one hand, there's more demand than ever, right, to recognize that customer, to personalize a great experience, to be available wherever that customer wants to engage. And yet we also now are living in this age where there's more regulations and privacy needs, consent, a loss of signal, say, from which makes it harder, right, to get the data you want to use into position to be applied to customer experiences. So I think the big changes have been, first changing the aperture of the data that comes into play. Certainly trying to offset the loss of some of that signal, behavioral data, contextual data, more enterprise data coming into this. And that, of course, supports actual marketing and advertising execution work, but creates a way to create continuity in data sets, operates across that customer lifecycle, supports pulling together identity across multiple spaces. And something you mentioned, which I was really glad to hear about, is the aspect of speed. I don't think we talk about velocity enough. things are getting faster. We don't live in a batch world anymore, and consumers certainly do not live in a batch world. The velocity of engagement has accelerated, and that puts a huge amount of, say, technical strain on how experiences occur, right? Being able to recognize a customer, make a decision around experience, deliver it back, oftentimes in milliseconds at essentially a transactional level, has made it important for a lot of marketing organizations to rethink the technical underpinnings, right, of how they execute not just identity, but customer experience as well. And then finally, siloed identity, I think, doesn't work anymore. We're coming out of a world where things pretty much were organized on a channel-by-channel basis. And that doesn't work in today's modern engagement model with consumers. We have to have transit across the entire customer life cycle. We do not live in a channel-specific ecosystem. We have to have cohesive experiences anywhere a customer is and at any point in that customer life cycle. So when you talk about interoperability, right, that's a strong response to how do you create a cohesive set of identification and transit across multiple identity spaces so that you can engage with a customer, again, in that moment where they want to engage with your brand.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Joe said. I think there's a lot of regulatory and sort of privacy changes that marketers have to keep up with. And then there's also just changing consumer sentiment and changing consumer attitudes and education around privacy. I think coming out of the pandemic, consumer buying behavior changed. There's a rise in buy online, pick up in store that marketers have to sort of keep up with. But there was also sort of this shift to aligning our buying behaviors with our values. Consumers are more likely to buy from brands that their values and general views. So I think there's a lot of sentiment changes to keep up with there as well. And, to Joe's point, like consumers now expect these experiences. I think that's one of the biggest changes coming out of the pandemic is brands are increasingly competing on the experience they deliver to customers and less so on products and services. And so you may have a more expensive product, but if you deliver a better experience to the customer, they may be more likely to buy from you. So I think that coupled with the fact that data privacy has been in the news a lot with all of these new regulations. And so consumers who weren't necessarily aware before of how their data was being used are very aware now of how that data is being used. And so it's not that they won't share that data, but they're really looking to share that with brands that they trust. And so from a marketer perspective, I think that is also important. And you build that trust not only through, your good data governance and privacy practices, but also in, how you interact with the customer, the messaging you deliver them, keeping up with their preferences, all of that. So I think it's important to combine all of those things together, the regulatory, the tech changes, and taking into account consumer sentiment.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider. I think that's like, if I were to distill it, right, the meta point is, hey, there's a ton of stuff for you to think about. And Joe, you said opposing forces. I think that's generally, what we try to talk about with me and my team and in the marketplace is there's a lot to consider. Very often the considerations conflict with each other. They're opposing forces. If you don't have some sense of a strategy and how you want to approach consumer data and identity, then you're just going to get washed out to sea. And so I think that's the important thing that I don't think I completely highlighted
agree.
enough. Oh, go ahead, Joe.
What you were saying about experiences trickling down, it was going to happen, I think, before the pandemic, right? I call it the Amazon effect. If I can get batteries delivered in less than 24 hours to my home when I run out of mouse batteries or whatever, why can't I have a great experience with some other random industry like getting a car insurance quote, right? You had all these industries who were basically minding their own business. They were just getting run over by consumer expectations that had almost nothing to do with them, right? And that certainly accelerated during this phase of digital transformation coming into and out of COVID.
Yeah. So, so you've got all of those considerations. Then I talked a little bit about data chaos, so sort of, somewhat more specifically. So, what does data chaos mean to you, Emily? And how do you feel? You touched a little bit about, experience with a customer and a client. How do you feel like customers and clients are sort of experiencing it as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much data out there to be collected. I mean, virtually everything we have on us at all times is generating data. We have smartwatches, we've got fitness devices, we have smartphones, things. And so it's really easy to get caught up in the quantity game, I think, when it comes to data, because there's so much out there to be collected. But I think you have to start to separate what you could be collecting from what you should be collecting. And to your point, that starts with a really great data strategy. And I think you have to sort of start with the end in mind. What are the use cases that you want to be able to fulfill? What's your vision from a consumer experience perspective, from a business intelligence perspective? And then you sort of have to work backwards from there. Based on those use cases, what are the data points that you need to have in order to fulfill those use cases? And obviously there's, technological components involved in that as well. But that's, you've got to sort of sift through the noise of data and really distill down to like, what are the critical data points that you need to be collecting in order to fulfill those use cases, so that you can start to bring some order to, what are we going to collect? How are we going to collect it? Where are we going to store it? How are we going to manage it? All of that. So I think, a enterprise-wide data strategy, not just a digital targeting strategy, not just an insight strategy, like really tying it all together from an enterprise perspective of, what is the data strategy for our organization and how we're going to collect and use that data to benefit everybody. It's got to be mutually beneficial to the business and to the customer. So I think that's really key, is focusing on, the quality of the data and the strategy behind it, and less so on the quantity of the data that you're collecting.
I completely agree with that. Data chaos is real. And nobody lacks for data. In all the years I've been doing this, I've never had a client call up and say, Joe, I need more data. We've got data coming out of the woodwork. Most clients would probably like to have less data if they had a choice, so they could focus a little bit. Ultimately, this isn't a data volume issue or even a collection or warehousing issue. This is really about managing that data and getting it in position to be actionable. And you can't make that up as you go along anymore. So data chaos, I think, really tweaks this weakness that you see in a lot of organizations where they have an incomplete data strategy, or they just haven't updated it yet, right? To really accommodate or game out, the new environment that we're in and going to be going through. So just gathering a lot of data, throwing it in a warehouse somewhere and saying you're going to sort it out later is essentially an abdication of your responsibility at this stage, because you're never going to go back and sort it out. I mean, we're only human. That's not how things work. And you start hearing these things that are the red flags, right? You'll hear about, oh, we're going to go build a golden record, or we're just going to lob the data into a data lake or a CDP. And that just isn't enough, right? You have to have an actual cohesive data strategy, like Emily said, about what are we using data for? Where are we using it? What data? This is a curation play. What data serves those use cases, and how are we going to handle it and get it to the right places? So really thinking through, how are we going to identify and recognize a customer? That's the identity piece. How are you going to manage that data and the quality of that data? And even enrichment, where's the data coming from? How can we enhance and complete this data and really get it integrated? So I think it's just never been more important to have a strong, planned out data strategy. And it's perfect time. If you haven't gone through that recently, it's a good time to start that exercise, because you have the perfect excuse. All the changes happening around us. This is the perfect time to reimagine your data strategy.
Yeah, and I think to tie back to the question around like how clients are experiencing it, to give a nod to the fact that, like from an agency perspective, we have clients all over the spectrum as far as what vertical they're in. And so there is a, cost benefit and sort of a relative value of collecting your own first party data versus, sourcing data. And I think there's even some chaos in how do we source data as a CPG brand when there are hundreds of data partners out there. How do we, sift through what are the right partners and how they source their data, what type of data do we need, what are the gaps that we're trying to fill. So I think it's not just about how a brand collects data, first party data on their own, but it's also those brands where, the value just isn't there to collect as much first party data, or it's a smaller part of their strategy. And so again, like an enterprise wide data strategy, thinking about how do we use first party data, where do we need to source second and third party data, and how do all of those things fit together to bring value to the business.
Emily, I would be interested because, thinking about your relationship with, not as a data strategy for the agency, but as a, helping a customer deal with these market forces. One of the things that we talk about a lot, or I like to focus on, is like, you develop and implement the strategy, it's important to have it because there's change management that needs to occur post that strategy. So if you aren't really bought in to what this means to you as a marketer, as an organization, you're going to feel those paper cuts, more deeply if you're not rooted in something. So, how are you experiencing that too in the consultation you're having with customers and saying, look, like this is, you need to develop this and here are the implications beyond just, dotting the I's and crossing the T's?
Yeah, I think that can be like the most challenging part from an agency perspective, is working with clients, helping them sell the value of a data strategy internally, because you have to have a cross-functional group, because data strategy really affects the entire organization. And I think especially when these initiatives sort of start with the marketing team, it's hard to get people to think of use cases beyond marketing. But when you start to, be able to package up and sell internally the value of, when we do collect this data, these are the insights that we can derive from the data, and here's how it affects you in finance, or here's how it affects you in real estate planning if you're opening new retail locations. Like helping to sell the value of that internally, I think is a key piece of what we do as an agency, in helping clients develop that data strategy. Is, I always, joke that it's 60% politics and 40% actual strategy when it comes to selling in a data strategy, because it really is so much of the work is getting those cross-functional stakeholders on board, so that they understand the value of collecting and using data, not just from a marketing perspective, but how it impacts the entire organization.
That makes sense. So Joe, I have a question for you, because you said a couple of words that I wanted to key in on. You said, customers saying golden record and, all the CDP can sort of handle that for me. So what do you think in the context of those sort of, kind of approaches or thought processes, how does a marketer's just general approach to identity need to change today, given, distractions, the change management require all of those factors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of involves starting to think very practically, right? And specifically about what it's going to take to assemble, develop a solution or a environment that supports what you want to accomplish as a business. And I know that sounds really straightforward, like B-School 101 stuff, but the reality here, it's, and if you haven't accepted already, it's just time to say, okay, we're going to be forced to do more with less. We are losing signal. There aren't any simple like-for-like replacement solutions. You can't just break the glass and pull out a magical cookie replacement. That doesn't exist. So we're going to have to adapt to a new ecosystem. And so, I think it's really a conversation around starting now and trying to turn these disruptive forces into something that can be advantageous. I think the companies that adapt sooner will develop more advantages than their competitors will. Essentially, I don't think we should be letting a good crisis go to waste here. If we're going to have to make changes, make changes that we can really bend into and support our business. For me, the biggest thing is thinking about continuity, right? Not where do we want to be in 5 years or where were we 6 months ago, but how do we get from essentially A to B and plan that out? It's almost like more of a road mapping exercise. How are we going to develop solutions that keep our business operating today, right? But also create the flexibility to be really successful over the long term, right? And adapt to what is still a very dynamic environment, right? We don't have all the final answers. We don't know how everything is going to manifest in 1 or 2 or 5 years. So flexibility and agility in our planning is really important as well. So I think Emily started getting to this, is thinking about this in terms of use cases. What do you apply identity towards? What levels of resolution for what use cases? Are there different types of identity? Because there's a whole spectrum of what identity is. And you don't need any more or less than what your use cases demand, right? How do you apply it? Because identity is a means to an end to supporting the business. I think clients now can start understanding their exposure to the changes in the marketplace. What interactions, channels, programs, personalization efforts, are impacted by these changes or will be. What's the actual impact on your business when some of these things change or possibly go away? That supports the business case, and I think the internal work with stakeholders to say that change is necessary now so that we can be successful smoothly and have continuity moving forward, right? Not that it's just a pie in the sky, we're scared that cookies are going away, but this has a real effect on us in a specific set of ways. and we need to adapt to that. And that supports, our revenue growth goals or our customer engagement goals or whatever KPIs and strategic initiatives we have at the company. And finally, I think we turn it into an opportunity to say, this is an opportunity for us to advance some of our practice areas. Can we, by having a strong plan for identity resolution, support better customer insights, better attribution and measurement efforts moving forward? Do we get better personalization, customer engagement opportunities that otherwise would have been throttled or unavailable today due to existing limitations? But now, because we're going to make these adjustments, we can start taking advantage of more data, better identity resolution, new techniques for resolving identities to accomplish our goals. So a lot of it's positioning, but a lot of it is really having a plan for this and thinking in terms of very specific applications.
Yeah, I would totally echo the sentiment around this being a road mapping exercise. I think you have to have that vision, that North Star, whether it's, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, but what do we want those use cases to look like in 5 years? What do we want the customer experience to look like in 5 years? And so when you have that North Star, to Joe's point, like you have to be agile in how you get there, because there are going to be changes in the regulatory landscape. There's going to be changes in technology, but it doesn't change where you're going. Where you want to go is still the same. Those use cases are still the same. You may need to adjust how you fulfill those use cases, but I think, without having an idea of where you're going, it's really hard to, you end up swatting flies, I guess is the best way to say it when it comes to these changes. You're constantly in a mode of reacting to what's going on in the marketplace rather than being focused on here's where we're going and, saying, okay, now we need to be flexible because this new privacy regulation came up, or there's this new piece of technology that we want to test. And so that's where also having a test and learn plan, I think, is critical, because again, you may think that, there's a certain way to best fulfill a use case now, but we're going to constantly have new things popping up and learn new things, and there may be a better way to do it. And so we constantly have to be testing and learning and adjusting that roadmap. And again, it doesn't change the destination, but it does change maybe how we get there as we learn new things.
That makes a ton of sense. And if you think about sort of, in my experience, some things that occurred, if we got a true north out here, to your point, if we keep that, that's where we're headed, but we're okay with some deviations along the way. Well, Joe, you said, what did you say about don't let a good crisis go to waste? And something like, the off again, on again deprecation of the cookie, right? And so when that happened, we saw so many partners, customers, prospects go through this moment of, oh no, right? What am I going to do? And I think partly because, or maybe more than just partly, is because that consumer data strategy wasn't as strong as it needed to be to accept that possible reality and to understand how they work in a space that's going to change. Well, the gaps and the fluidity with which we're going to deviate from that path is going to be challenging. It's going to be ups and downs along the way. And so I think you guys hit on some really interesting things there.
But what I don't want it to just be is, how do we remediate, for example, the loss of cookies? How do we get back to where we were? Because cookies are going, let's just replace cookies. It's not just a replacement strategy, in my opinion. It needs to be, how do we take these changes and move things forward, right? Because the privacy, consent needs, preference management needs, the way customers want us to engage, and some different underlying techniques around identity and other capabilities to accomplish that. So I don't want us to go through all this effort just to be where we were before. I want us to go through all this effort and actually progress, the discipline and what we can accomplish for consumers.
And so that brings me to a question, Emily, I have for you, because you said something earlier that I think makes it an interesting thing for you to react to. But this notion of, I gave the reference to, customers that had an oh no moment when the cookie went away. And Joe, your point around let's not just try to find a replacement. We did see, I saw a lot of success in folks that said, okay, I'm gonna shrink back and focus on the core data asset that I believe is meaningful, my first party data, right? And so where are you seeing, Emily, the best ways that marketers are either getting value or investing in their first party data today?
Well, I mean, I mentioned it before, but I think there's relative value in investing in first party data depending on the nature of your business. So it may not make sense for you to fully lean into first party data if you're selling toothpaste, for example. Like everyone needs toothpaste. And so, you have to really think about like what's the value in collecting, first party data around that. But I think, knowledge is power. And so the more knowledge you have about your customers, the smarter your business decisions are going to be. So whether you're deriving that knowledge and value from first party data or some combination of first, second, and third party data, I think that's probably the biggest value because it informs your targeting strategy. So it informs how you're going to market to customers. It informs products that you might offer to customers. It impacts your ongoing relationship with a customer as you're collecting preferences and cross-selling and upselling into different products. And so I think that is, at the core, the biggest value of first party data and data in general is the insight that it can bring to your business, because the more information you have, the better informed you are and the better decisions that you can make.
I would agree with that. I mean, certainly the world's attention has shifted to first party data, given the circumstances, and what are we left with? And that's where the focus is. I also agree. I think sometimes we borderline over-index on the concept of first-party data as the standalone catch-all that's going to save for everything. I think it is important to focus on first-party data and make the most of that asset as it relates to your business. That is certainly a smart thing to do, and we encourage that. But I think it also has a broader effort underneath it, right? That's focused not only on first-party data, but on zero-party data, second-party data with partners, even third-party data is not going away completely and still has tremendous value. And there's a lot of strong use cases for it, depending on the type and the source. So I think, again, it rolls up to a broader data strategy, but it perhaps is first-party centric is the way I might describe it. And I do think the benefits of thinking in terms of first-party data are good. I mean, it, again, creates sort of that foundation, right, that a brand owns, becomes an asset. As Emily said earlier, you want to take it beyond marketing, which I strongly encourage in terms of a long-term strategy and point of view. You're building a data asset internally that has a broad set of benefits to your business. It is an asset. I've suggested it should be on the balance sheet as something, because it's something your competitors don't own. They can't replicate it. Using it for broader customer experience, for analysis, for measurement, using it with partners, it has tremendous value. And so it creates this foundation that kind of insulates you from some of the market disruption, helps you manage, a likely kind of patchwork quilt of third-party solutions, and again, supports a notion of differentiation from competitors.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier around like the deprecation of third-party cookies and it not being, sort of a replacement strategy. I think we're sort of flipping on its head the strategy that's been used before, where there's all of these data partners. And so I'm just, piecing them together, and that's my data strategy. Whereas now, regardless of what industry you're in, first-party data has value because, to Joe's point, it's a competitive advantage. None of your competitors have that same data. But I think it's, in terms of building the strategy now, it's more about, let's start with what we can do and what makes sense for us to do. And then we layer in second-party data and third-party data where it makes sense. Whereas before, I think, there was so much data out there to be had that we could, target at scale with, decent relevance. And so we just went to that as our, it became kind of a commodity and the price was good. And so we sort of started with that for our strategy, but now it's more about filling gaps with that extra data and starting with, like what's our competitive advantage and what can we do for ourselves first before we start to bring in additional sources of data.
Yeah, you guys have said a couple of words that ring true to me. Things like filling gaps, you just said, Emily, validation, conflict, frankly. So when we talk about first-party data, you've got, if you look to extend it in the second and third-party data space, how do you deal with, inherent conflict and go back to opposing forces of, enriching that data or making use of it. And again, if you don't simplify your operations, you're not going to be able to put valuable people to work, deriving insights from that data. You're just going to spend your time organizing it. And now you've got a pretty set of data, but it's not very useful. So Anyway, so the group here has a ton of industry experience. Joe, you've talked about some, a number of things in the evolution that we've gone through with technology and identity, from DMPs to CDPs to cloud platforms, clean rooms now, and that evolution can be challenging in terms of implementation of some of the strategy we want to put into the market. So how can marketers build a more sustainable, and you've hit on it a couple of times. I don't know if you've used that word specifically, but I feel like thematically you have. Build a more sustainable identity strategy that will last for years and years, rather than just focus on, okay, we've got to deal with disruption now. Let's build something that lasts for years.
Yeah, we did mention the aspect of planning and the road mapping exercise, and stand by that. I think we all believe in that here. I think it's an important way to think about it. Again, it's the practical way, right? You can avoid boiling the ocean with a roadmap in a world where these things take time, they take effort, and it's still a dynamic environment. So we need some flexibility, right? And sway for how this is going to play out over the long term. But I think it's also practical in terms of understanding timing, the resources, the budgets, the stakeholders, which are numerous, in getting this done. It's not just marketing making it up as it go along or trying to go rogue in an organization, which I don't think they want to, and we don't encourage. What I think tends to get underestimated in all of this, and where even sometimes I will concede I struggle to have conversations because it starts going above my pay grade, is creating a technical plan. We have a roadmap. We're going to buy some foundational technologies. It could be a CDP. Maybe we need clean room. We're going to work with the agency, to do some of that work, the data sourcing. Those things are good as you play this out. But ultimately, there's a huge customer engagement strategy aspect to this. You have to take, I think, ultimately a top-down approach to making this sustainable over the long term, because I think first-party data strategy and data strategy in general is fundamentally, I think, less technical than it is strategic. And that's a typical conversation. It's easier to go buy some technology or think that Emily's going to work with us and get us a few new data sources, and that's going to fix everything. I would like the easy button too, and for Emily to fix everything. That would be great. But really what we're talking about is how do we adapt the customer experience to support a data and engagement strategy that can be successful in this environment. And that's a much different level of thinking. You need to update, it's not just changing a couple of web pages or policies or how you do your databases. How do we engage with customers to create mutual value, to progressively collect data in that first party strategy? How do we incentivize engagement with our customers to connect all this data together and have connectivity and interoperability across all that data? That's a much bigger marketing and customer experience conversation at a very strategic and senior level that then trickles down into those use cases and the technology and the roadmap. So I feel like we need to ladder up some of these discussions, because you can have the best database. We can go implement an amazing CDP or have the clean room set up. But if we're not getting the feed, if we're not supporting customer value, right, strategically, it's not going to age well. And so this is becoming a strategic conversation, I think, very quickly, at least with a lot of my clients.
I would agree with that. I mean, it goes right back to the conversation we had about, road mapping and having a vision. The how you get there, excuse me, is going to continue to evolve, but you're still moving in that direction. And so that, I think, adds a level of sustainability to it, because you know where you're going. And so if you have a solid foundation, a solid data architecture in place, and I think as long as you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, like if your eggs have all historically been in the, third-party cookie-based data basket, then, you're scrambling right now. So I think it's, making sure that you have, kind of diversified your data strategy. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that if you have an enterprise-wide data strategy and you have a North Star for where you're going, that automatically adds a level of sustainability that maybe didn't exist when you were just relying on third-party data sources.
Yeah, one of the things we like to talk about at TU is, this, consumer focused, if not consumer obsessed, right? I think, Joe, you hit on some of those things around, and also information for good, right? So let's talk about how we do all these things in an effort to drive mutual value exchange, right? Not necessarily just with the consumer, but with our partners, right, too, so that we're properly sharing that value and ultimately delivering a better experience for the consumer. So anyway, well, I really appreciate Joe, Emily, you guys going through some of that. Nancy, I would suggest maybe, do we have some questions from the crowd? I assume we do by now.
We absolutely do. So yes, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. It was so in-depth. I picked up myself so many tidbits, and we have lots of questions from the audience. So why don't I jump on over to those? The first question that we have is, are there initiatives that are leveraging non-personalized data to target? DOOH, for example, may be location-centric versus identity-centric. Can someone answer that?
I can give a view from the TransUnion heritage. I come from a line of acquisitions that TransUnion has done, but in the DOOH space, you still have a general sense of a trade area segment as an example, and so you can do market segmentation within that trade area to say, you get a complexion using rooted in real identity, right? Partnering with the data sets that are available. To layer on top of a physical address and start to understand you can start to describe that trade area or that specific physical location on the earth to support basically any DOOH use case out there. So we do a lot of that today, and I think they're really interesting strategies because it is it's anonymized in the sense that it's not specific individuals you're targeting, but you're still using your underlying consumer data strategy to inform the way you interpret that market and interpret how you want to reach that market.
Yeah, I would layer onto that it does go right back to that idea of enterprise data strategy and thinking about it from the sales funnel, the customer funnel, and what data do you use at which point in the funnel. So out of home might be a little bit of a broader targeting, but to Casey's point, there's still a high level of relevance there when you're thinking about location. So where does that fit in the funnel? Because at that level, it doesn't make sense to rely on first party data, location data, if third party location data makes sense there. So I think it all comes down to that great data strategy and thinking about where do we plug in the right data at what point in the funnel.
And just one final thought, that it would also factor into the performance management, the measurement strategy as well. What level of resolution are you doing that at? In some ways, out of home would be somewhat analogous. You're getting into store level analysis and things like that. So, how are you going to do, post either campaign or post engagement type analysis and measurement? Again, all comes out of having the information available for that, comes out of that data strategy.
Okay, thank you. Well, we can't have a webinar on identity without having a question about CDPs. So here we go. Does implementing a CDP help solve data fragmentation and changes in identity?
Yes and no. I think CDPs can be an option for part of the overall solution. CDPs are pretty popular right now. It's an exciting concept. The idea of getting more better data together faster and available to systems that generate insights and engagement is very powerful. And it kind of speaks to a lot of the underlying challenges we've been talking about around a lot of data that needs to be curated and moved with velocity and a level of quality. So I think there's a lot of interest in that as essentially the CDP as sort of this transit mechanism to bring more data together, again, in a practical way that becomes available to marketers, for their insights and execution. That's an issue because you're building, fortunately with a CDP, you're generating not just a pile of data or a data lake, it's a curated set of data that generates a set of data customer profiles, right, which are highly applicable and actionable. And so that's a powerful outcome. I think what we tend to see, though, is that a CDP is part of a broader solution. Generally, you're still going to ladder a CDP solution into a broader set of capability that involves data hygiene, data management, identity resolution, data enrichment and enhancement, to essentially make sure that the data in the CDP before it lands in any execution systems is as accurate, as deep, as robust as it can possibly be. So it's one of the options for accomplishing that. It's very popular. but it plays into still a larger identity and data play.
Thank you. Casey, Emily, anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we as TransUnion, as an identity and information services provider and analytics provider, we partner pretty heavily with a number of the CDPs of the market. And I would agree with what Joe's saying is, where we're seeing the most success today is folks that have a very particular vision in how they want to develop and implement and actionalize their consumer data strategy, where a CDP plays a valuable part in that value exchange between data sharing and data activation and data compilation. But there are definitely things to consider around the edges. And Joe, I think you said, identity resolution, additional validation, expansion and enrichment, just general hygiene, because there are some things that, partners in the ecosystem can add on top of it that I think is it's a very, very useful tool, but there are, definitely things around the edges that add additional value.
Yeah, I think Casey and Joe hit the nail on the head. I mean, ultimately, there is no one silver bullet solution. It's going to be a suite of solutions, putting together the best suite of solutions to deliver on that enterprise data strategy that you've developed. And, the CDP space is still pretty nascent. And so, CDPs are all over the spectrum. So if you don't have a really good understanding of what you're using a CDP for, you could very easily end up picking the wrong one for you because it doesn't have the functionality and capabilities that you were looking for. So I think that is, priority number one is understanding what your needs are out of a CDP or just your data strategy in general before you can really decide if a CDP is right for you. And if a CDP is right for you, which one is the right one for you?
Great points. Next question we have, do you think Google's announcement on cookie deprecation will change behavior between now and when it goes into effect?
I thought you were going to say, will it change? And then just ask the question, because who knows? Right. So, right. I mean, I think really and truly, like that, my position, I think, is, we saw it happen. I don't even remember when that was, when it was first announced, and here we are, and it's moved out to 2024. So I think again, consistent, North Star or strategy in place should be the focus, right? And so I'm just going to leave it at that and open it up to Joe or Emily to comment more.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually was speaking on a panel just like this, literally the day that Google announced they were pushing it out to 2024, which was funny because a lot of the conversation centered around the deprecation of third-party cookies. So I think we could debate all day long whether or not that's actually going to come to fruition, but I think there's still value in continuing to test and learn different identity solutions, cookieless solutions, and move towards, again, like I mentioned before, move towards like relying on yourself first and what you can do internally as far as data before relying just on third-party data partners. I do think initially there was a shift in client perception on the urgency of testing some of those solutions. I think, from an agency perspective, at least I saw clients starting to deprioritize some of that testing when that announcement came out. And so I've encouraged clients to, continue to test and learn. But to go back to Joe's earlier point, like not look at it as a replacement strategy. And for as long as third-party cookies still exist, if that data makes sense in your data strategy, continue to use it too.
We saw the same phenomenon, which is interesting. Sort of, there was a lot of momentum around dealing with this. And then when they pushed it back the second time, we sort of skidded into more of a malaise and maybe possibly a credibility issue around when and how this is happening. I think we should assume it is. I do not presume to know exactly what Google will do when or how they think about these things, but I would assume it's happening. And even outside of Google, this was already in play, right? All the other browsers had been dealing with cookies anyway. And it is a nice opportunity to reduce reliance on an imperfect system. So understanding exposure and having a plan that is somewhat Google agnostic, I think is still very important.
Yeah, that notion of interoperability, right? Just making sure that you're doing your data work on identifiers that are multiple, varied, can transact across the ecosystem. Yeah, I think that's that all makes sense to me.
And we have time for a couple more questions. You talked a lot about use cases. And Emily, I think you even said you've turned into a politician pitching different use cases to different departments across the organization. Can any of you share what are some of the most common marketing use cases for leveraging identity resolution?
So I can start. We as TransUnion have a number of services in that space, and so when we talk about identity resolution, a lot of what we see is in sort of an enrichment and a gap filling capacity. So I talked about the data chaos, and you have incomplete records, you have duplicate records, and we talk about a CDP, say perhaps stitching together, Casey Rogers and my phone number because I logged into a website and a web behavior, right? And bringing that together into one sort of record internally. But you talk about identity resolution as the addition of saying, well, who else lives in that household? Was the address that he provided something that he lived at 3 years ago? So how do we update that? Because perhaps one of my large marketing strategies or event strategies or just general profiling of customers is related to where they live, and it needs to be accurate, right? So whether that's a marketing use case or some other business use case for truly understanding and resolving identity and keeping it up to date, and then giving it the opportunity to append to third-party data for additional enrichment or extend that identity out into an ecosystem that, say, let's forget the cookie and say, again, extend that profile and that user and that household out into the marketplace for targeting. Do you have the right identity fragments to actually target the household and the individual across your media plan, right? Across your marketing stack. So that is the use cases. Those are some of the use cases we see, which is, help me tie records together, help me enrich them, perform better hygiene, and then let me take action on them.
Well, I'm a big fan of identity resolution. I would generically say that identity resolution is literally the most important thing that marketers ever do, because if the identity resolution isn't correct, literally nothing else matters. That's a bit of a cop-out of an answer because it's so broad. So we need identity resolution to do literally everything. Where I tend to see it is it breaks down still into kind of categories. You have the set of, on the identity spectrum, the set of identity use cases around especially digital advertising, the pseudonymous space of knowing customers. Then, of course, you have the known customer. You start getting in the PII known customer space. There's a variant that primarily aligns with the measurement, right? The right level of resolution to support measurement, attribution, model media, MMM modeling, and performance management. What we're hearing more of, and it's still a little bit broad, is, but it's a good push into taking identity resolution seriously and thinking about progressing the state of the art, is needing identity to support personalization. Now, personalization is broad. It means different things to different organizations. I admit that, but it's a great watchword. I actively listen for that term, and it comes up multiple times a week with our clients. It's the top reported challenge with marketing technology buyers at Forrester this year. Wanting to create individualized, highly targeted, highly personalized experiences for customers, being able to get more granular, being able to deliver those faster on more recent insights, all depends really on the identity layer to pull that data together, and it drives a lot of reimagining of that data strategy.
Yeah, I think Casey and Joe said it all really well. It's from a marketing perspective, it's a big piece of understanding our consumers better through enrichment. It's, lookalike modeling. How do we find more people who look like our customers and target them in the digital space? It's all things addressable media. So how do we, find these specific people and target them? And then, the measurement piece, like Joe mentioned, is huge. Identity resolution plays a huge role in being able to provide closed loop measurement. So we could probably talk all day long about use cases for identity resolution and marketing.
Thank you. And I'm going to end with this question because it's very realistic. Here we are, mid-2023. As we know, organizations over the past year are really getting hit with budget cuts and resource cuts. The question is, how can I manage data chaos if I don't have the resources to build a new enterprise cloud?
It's a great question. Great
Oh, go
question.
ahead, Joe.
Also, I can't believe it's June.
I know, right?
I just thought of that this morning. It's nothing to do with the webinar, but we just had middle of 2023. That kind of blew my mind. Great to be here. As we discussed earlier, I think this hinges on executing a robust data strategy. I think the best thing you can do is just focus, like narrow that aperture of the data challenge and opportunity, right? And you do this by taking an inventory of the data you have or need, and that by extension becomes a definition of the identity needs. And those are the use cases, and that's what you're going to apply. No more, no less. You don't need all the data. You need the right data. And as I said earlier, this is very much a curation play where marketers need the right data to do their work. And if you have the right roadmap in place, you can build out or expand or even remove data later as conditions dictate.
Yeah, and I think a good place to start, rather than thinking about, how do I re-architect my entire stack or marketing cloud, is to really dig into what are the, tech pieces that I have now and what functionality do they all have? Because I find that the vast majority of clients are underutilizing the capabilities that they have now. So how do we maximize the tech that we already have in place and the data that we already have in place? And how does that tie into our data strategy? Because there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit that won't cost as much in terms of time and resources. So it's really optimizing what you have now as you're, building that plan for, how are we going to get to where we want to go, and doing that gap analysis. I think it's really hard to do a gap analysis between ideal future state and current state if you don't have a full understanding of what capabilities you have right now, and if you're not maximizing those capabilities. So that would be, my recommendation is first place to start, because it can feel really overwhelming, is just really do a deep dive on the tech you already have in place and make sure that you're, taking advantage of all the capabilities that you have available.
Yeah, I think that's a really wise recommendation, Emily. And I think, if you don't have a data strategy, it's hard to assess, right? For you to go turn around and go look at what you have in the garage and say, am I prepared for summer, Joe? It is June, right? Am I prepared for the kids to play outside? I don't know what's in the garage. I don't know for sure, if I'm fully utilizing what I have. And again, if you don't have the strategy, it's not going to make sense.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Casey. The strategy is sort of the lens through which you look at your marketing stack, because you have to understand what it is you're trying to do before you can understand, do I have the capabilities to do it? So I think that's a really great point.
And in the context of, I think the question was around resource, like if I'm light on resources, right? I don't have, and the thing is there are a lot of tools and services. Once you do that internal review and you say, okay, maybe the capabilities are or are not there, the ones that you can add on top. I mean, in a sense, the intention should be that what you invest, you save more, right? So in this sense, focusing on identity is paramount, right? Because it's going to feed into everything else you do and make you more effective and more efficient down the line.
Fantastic. These were incredible insights. I appreciated. Obviously, our audience did too with all these great questions. So thank you very much for answering them all. Before we wrap up, let me take a moment, tell everybody what else is happening across eMarketer's media channels. Join me tomorrow, Friday, June 2nd. It is June, for Attention, Streaming and the New Digital Ad Economy. That is eMarketer's virtual summit. I will be here with guests from Albertsons Media Collective, Mountain, Wendy's, the IAB, and many of my colleagues across the organization, including our analysts. So please join us for that. There's still time to register on our events page. Keep an eye on your email. We're going to send out a recording to today's conversation. Please share it around your organization. This was so rich with information, and I'm positive it's going to help you move forward. And as I heard loud and clear today, help you build that roadmap, test, and learn. Thank you all for your time. And thanks again, Casey, Emily, and Joe, and the entire team at TransUnion. We'll see you all on our next Tech Talk, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks. Bye-bye.